The foreclosure notice lay on the weathered kitchen table like a death sentence, its crisp white edges a stark contrast to the calloused hands that held it. 60 days. After 3 generations and 70 years of working this land, it had come down to a number on a banker's ledger. Outside, the cornfield stretched toward the horizon, rows of stunted stalks gasping in the relentless drought, a failing legacy under a merciless sky. The old farmer stood at his porch, watching the sun bleed across the landscape that would soon belong to someone else. His back ached from decades of labor, his heart heavy with the burden of being the last. This land had witnessed births and deaths, triumph and heartbreak, had absorbed the sweat of his ancestors and the tears of his departed wife. Now it would witness his surrender, unless... The sound of tires on gravel cut through the evening stillness. A stranger with a camera was about to change everything, though neither of them could possibly know it yet. Raymond Miller stood at the edge of his failing cornfield, the morning sun casting long shadows across rows of stunted stalks. At 68, his weathered face bore the map of decades spent working this land, every crease earned through drought, flood, and the relentless cycle of planting and harvest that defined a farmer's life in Missouri. The envelope from Heartland Bank crumpled in his calloused hand, its contents already seared into his memory, 60 days until foreclosure. "Damn pump," he muttered, kicking at the irrigation equipment that had failed him yet again. The ancient John Deere tractor his father had purchased in 1976 sat idle nearby, its faded green paint peeling like the prospects of the farm itself. He'd need at least $2,000 to fix the irrigation system properly, money he simply didn't have. Raymond's eyes scanned the horizon where his 180 acres stretched toward Eagle River, land that had been in his family for 3 generations, land that would soon belong to someone else. The pain in his lower back flared as he bent to examine the pump housing. He straightened slowly, fishing the orange prescription bottle from his pocket. One pill left. The Medicare Part D donut hole had hit him hard this month, and the cardiologist's warning echoed in his mind. "You can't skip these, Ray. Not with your condition." The distant sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. Visitors were rare at Miller Farm, especially on a Tuesday morning. Raymond squinted against the sun, making out a modest blue SUV winding up his long driveway. He wasn't expecting anyone, and salespeople rarely ventured this far from town. The vehicle stopped near the barn, and a woman emerged mid-40s. Raymond guessed, dressed practically in hiking boots and cargo pants. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance but the expensive-looking camera equipment being unloaded from her vehicle. "Morning," Raymond called out, approaching with cautious curiosity. "Can I help you with something?" The woman looked up, momentarily startled, then quickly recovered. "Good morning. I'm Catherine Jenkins." She removed her sunglasses, revealing intelligent dark eyes. "I'm a documentary filmmaker working on a project about American waterways and rural ecosystems. Eagle River caught my attention when I was researching this area." "My river," Raymond frowned slightly. "It's one of the few in this region that hasn't been significantly altered by commercial development. The riparian zone is surprisingly intact." Catherine's enthusiasm was evident. "I've been documenting various waterways across the Midwest, focusing on their ecological significance and the people who live alongside them." And Raymond wasn't sure what a riparian zone was, but he understood enough to know she was some kind of environmentalist. In his experience, environmentalists and farmers didn't always see eye to eye. "I'm not interested in being in any documentaries, Miss Aunt Jenkins, and I've got work to do." He turned to leave. "I understand," she said quickly. "I'm not asking you to participate. I was actually hoping for permission to camp near the river for a few days to film the wildlife. I noticed you have a small clearing by the eastern bend. That would be perfect. I'd stay completely out of your way." Raymond paused, considering. The clearing she mentioned was far enough from the house that he'd barely notice her presence. And while he wasn't eager for company, there was something in her straightforward manner that didn't set off any internal alarms. "You planning to make trouble for farmers in this documentary of yours?" he asked bluntly. Catherine shook her head. Not at all. My focus is on the waterways themselves, the ecology, the wildlife, the natural cycles. I document what I find, not what I expect to find. Raymond studied her for a moment longer. The truth was, he could use the money, however modest the amount might be. I don't typically allow camping, but I might make an exception. For a fee, if she was surprised by his stipulation, she didn't show it. That's completely fair. Would $75 per day be acceptable? I'm planning to stay for up to a week. The amount was more generous than Raymond had expected. A quick calculation told him that could be up to $525, enough to cover his medication, with some leftover for the irrigation pump parts. You'll need to follow some rules: no fires except in a contained camp stove. Stay away from my livestock, and don't go wandering around the farm buildings without permission. Absolutely, Catherine agreed readily. I'll respect your property and privacy. I'm here for the river ecosystem, not to disturb your operations. Raymond nodded slowly. All right then. You can use that clearing by the big bend in the river. There's a path that leads down from where this driveway curves. Catherine reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, counting out several $20 bills. Thank you, Mr. Miller. I appreciate your flexibility. As he pocketed the money, Raymond felt a twinge of something, not quite shame, but close to it. It bothered him that he was reduced to renting out a patch of ground to make ends meet. But pride wouldn't pay the bills, and he was well past the luxury of turning down income, however small. There's a water pump near the old oak if you need it. Water's clean. Comes from our well. It was the closest he would come to a welcoming gesture. Thank you. I brought plenty of supplies, but that's good to know. She hesitated, then added, I noticed your cornfields on the drive in. This drought must be making things difficult. Raymond stiffened. He didn't discuss his financial troubles with strangers, especially not city people who wouldn't understand the complexities of modern farming. I manage. Been doing this all my life. Catherine seemed to sense his discomfort and changed the subject. Well, I won't keep you from your work. I'll get set up down by the river and stay out of your way. Raymond nodded and turned to leave, already refocusing on the day's tasks ahead. River floods sometimes when it rains hard up north. Even if it's dry here, keep an eye on the water level if the weather changes. Catherine worked methodically, setting up her camp with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Her four-person tent was larger than necessary for just her, but she needed the extra space for her equipment. A compact table unfolded to create a workspace for her laptop and portable hard drives, and her solar charging station would keep everything powered. What she hadn't mentioned to Raymond Miller was that she wasn't just any documentary filmmaker. Catherine Jenkins had made a name for herself with her series, American Watersheds, which had won critical acclaim on public television. Her approach, intimate, honest portrayals of overlooked natural spaces and the people connected to them, had resonated with viewers tired of sensationalized nature documentaries. Her most recent installment, however, had become controversial, focused on a small town affected by industrial pollution. The film had been criticized for manipulating footage and misrepresenting community members' positions. Catherine had stood by her work, but the controversy had cost her several contracts and damaged her reputation. Now, working independently, she had something to prove to herself as much as to her critics. By mid-afternoon, Catherine had her camp established and her primary equipment ready. The September sun cast golden light across the water, creating perfect conditions for her first shooting session. She waded carefully into the shallow river, her camera protected in a waterproof housing, and began capturing the underwater world's small fish darting between rocks, the hypnotic patterns of sunlight filtering through the surface, the gentle current shaping the sandy bottom. Time slipped away as she worked, lost in the meditative process of documentation. It was only when her stomach growled insistently that she realized the sun was setting. Emerging from the river, she dried off her equipment and set up her camp stove to prepare a simple dinner. As she ate, Catherine reviewed the day's footage on her laptop, making notes for tomorrow's shooting plan. The quality was excellent. This location had even more potential than she'd anticipated. The river supported a surprising diversity of life, and the evening light created stunning visuals as it played across the water's surface. Movement caught her eye, and she looked up to see Raymond Miller walking along the riverbank about 50 yards upstream. He didn't approach her camp, but paused occasionally to examine something on the ground or in the water, conducting his own survey of the property, perhaps, or simply taking an evening walk. Catherine considered calling out a greeting, but decided against it. His body language suggested he wasn't seeking interaction. Instead, she observed him discreetly, noting the way he moved with familiarity through the landscape, his eyes constantly assessing, his hands occasionally reaching down to test the soil or adjust something only he could see needed fixing. This was what fascinated her about people who worked the land: their intimate knowledge of their surroundings, their physical connection to the environment that most modern humans had lost. Raymond Miller might not use the terminology of ecology or conservation, but he read the landscape with a fluency that came from decades of daily observation. Inside her tent, with her laptop casting a blue glow across her features, Catherine began the process of organizing and backing up the day's work. On a separate document, she made notes about Raymond Miller and his farm observations that might prove useful if the human element of this story developed further. "Farmer shows signs of financial strain," she typed. "Equipment appears old. Fields partially fallow. Solo operation, no visible farm hands or family assistance. Pride intact despite hardship. Classic American farmer archetype: independent, resilient, possibly stubborn, potential story angle. Last of a dying breed, holding on to family legacy against mounting economic pressures." Catherine paused, considering whether she was being presumptuous in her assessment. She had a tendency to narrativize people quickly, an occupational hazard of documentary filmmaking. But her instincts were usually sound, and everything about Raymond Miller suggested a man fighting a losing battle against forces beyond his control. Raymond awoke before his 5 hours alarm, as he had nearly every day of his adult life. Farm habits died hard, even when there was less farm work to do than in years past. He moved through his morning routine mechanically: coffee first, then a simple breakfast of toast and eggs from his own chickens. The kitchen felt too large for just one person, as it had since Eleanor's passing 8 years ago. He'd never been one for unnecessary talk, but the absence of her gentle morning chatter still left a hollow space in his day. After breakfast, Raymond pulled on his work boots and headed out to check on his livestock. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. He'd never tired of farm mornings, even as everything else about agricultural life had grown harder. His cell phone rang, an unusual occurrence this early. The screen showed Dr. Patel's office, and Raymond felt a knot form in his stomach. "Miller," he answered gruffly. "Mr. Miller, this is Jessica from Dr. Patel's cardiology office. I'm calling about your prescription renewal." "What about it? I left a message yesterday." "Yes, that's why I'm calling. Our records show you haven't had your 6-month follow-up yet, which Dr. Patel requires before renewing your medication. The earliest appointment we have is next Thursday." Raymond closed his eyes briefly. "Next Thursday is too late. I'm down to my last pill." "I understand, but it's office policy. If you'd kept your appointment in July..." "The combine broke down. I couldn't leave the farm." He didn't add that he also couldn't afford the $45 copay at the time. "Look, I need that medication. Dr. Patel said it was non-negotiable with my condition." There was a pause on the line. "Let me see what I can do. Maybe the doctor can approve a 2-week supply until your appointment. But Mr. Miller, you really need to come in. Your last test showed..." "I know what they showed." He cut her off, not wanting to hear it again. "Just call in whatever he'll approve to Miller's Pharmacy in Oak Ridge." "I'll try. And Mr. Miller, the doctor also mentioned a cardiac rehabilitation program that might be covered by your Medicare. It could help with just the prescription. Please. Raymond ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His chest felt tight stress. Not his heart, he told himself. The farm equipment dealership had already repossessed his newer tractor last month, leaving him with only the ancient John Deere his father had purchased back in the 1970s. The bank had been patient, more patient than most would be, but even their goodwill had limits. Raymond had 60 days to come up with enough money to catch up on his mortgage payments, or the auction signs would go up. As he drove down the rutted path that led to the river, Raymond spotted movement near the water's edge. Catherine Jenkins was already up and working, standing knee-deep in the river with her camera pointed at something just below the surface. She wore quick-dry pants rolled up to her knees and appeared completely absorbed in her task. Raymond parked the truck and approached the pump housing, keeping a respectful distance from his tenant. But curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself watching her work. Her movements were precise, patient, almost ritualistic as she waited motionless for long moments before adjusting her position slightly and continuing to film. "Morning," he called out, not wanting to startle her by working silently nearby. Catherine looked up, seeming momentarily disoriented as she shifted her attention from whatever she'd been filming. Then she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her serious face. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. You're up early." "Always am," he replied, opening the metal housing that protected the irrigation pump. "Checking the pump. Storms might be coming tomorrow. I heard on the forecast." She nodded. "Don't worry about me. I've camped through plenty of bad weather." Raymond grunted acknowledgement as he examined the pump's filters for debris. "River can rise fast here. Flash flood once took out a whole section of bank 10 years back." Catherine waded carefully out of the water, carrying her camera. "Thanks for the warning. I'll move my equipment to higher ground before the storm hits." As she reached the bank, Raymond could see she held a small waterproof case in her other hand. She opened it, revealing a tiny camera no bigger than a golf ball. "Just collecting my time-lapse camera. It's been running all night." "Catch anything interesting?" Raymond asked, surprising himself with the question. "A family of raccoons visited around midnight, a few deer before dawn." She smiled again. "And something I think might have been a mink, though it moved too quickly for a clear shot." Raymond nodded. "Plenty of mink around here. They den along the banks upstream." "You know the wildlife well," Catherine observed, setting her equipment on a folding table near her tent. Raymond shrugged as he closed the pump housing. "Been watching them all my life. My grandfather used to trap mink for their pelts back when that was still good business. Taught me to read their signs when I was just a boy." Catherine's eyes lit with interest. That's exactly the kind of local knowledge that gets lost between generations. The relationship between people and the land, changing over time. Something in her tone made Raymond wary again. It sounded too much like the beginning of a lecture about how farming practices had changed for the worse, how modern agriculture had lost its connection to nature. He'd heard it before from well-meaning environmentalists who'd never had to make payroll or watch crops fail despite their best efforts. "Need to check the corn," he said abruptly, turning toward his truck. "Storm might damage what's left if it hits hard." "Of course," Catherine replied, her tone neutral. "I didn't mean to keep you from your work." Raymond paused, feeling a twinge of guilt at his brusque response. She was paying to be here, after all, and hadn't actually said anything critical. "Water level markers on that post there," he said, pointing to a painted stake driven into the riverbank. "If it rises above the red line, you should move to higher ground. You're welcome to use the equipment shed up near the house if things get rough." The offer surprised them both. Raymond rarely invited anyone into his spaces, and Catherine clearly hadn't expected the concession. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate that." By midday, dark clouds were building on the western horizon, moving in faster than the forecast had predicted. Raymond hurried to secure loose equipment and move anything vulnerable to water damage. As he worked, he found himself glancing toward the river, wondering if Catherine Jenkins was heeding the warning signs of the approaching storm. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. A sleek black Mercedes was making its way up his driveway, a vehicle that looked dramatically out of place against the weathered farm buildings. Raymond's jaw tightened. He recognized the car immediately. James Wheeler, senior loan officer at Heartland Bank, stepped out in his crisp navy suit, looking as out of place on the farm as his vehicle. At 55, Wheeler represented everything Raymond resented about modern banking: slick, impersonal, and utterly detached from the realities of agricultural life. "Mr. Miller," Wheeler called out with forced joviality. "Thought I'd stop by since I was in the area. How are things?" "Same as when you sent that notice," Raymond replied, making no move to shake the offered hand. "You didn't need to drive out here. I can read." Wheeler's smile didn't waver. "Just doing my due diligence. The bank likes to maintain personal relationships with our clients, especially in challenging situations." "You mean when you're about to take someone's land?" "Now, Mr. Miller, that's not how we see it. We're exploring options here. Perhaps a restructured loan, or even a potential buyer who might lease the land back to you." Raymond's eyes narrowed. "What buyer?" "Midwest Agricultural has expressed interest in several properties in this area. They're expanding their operations in—" "Midwest Agricultural?" Raymond interrupted. "The same outfit that's been buying up every foreclosed farm in the county and turning them into factory operations." Wheeler shrugged. "They're a modern agribusiness with the capital to invest in improving productivity. The offer could be a win-win." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Raymond glanced at the approaching storm front. "I've got work to do before that hits. If you'll excuse me." "Of course." Wheeler didn't move. "But Mr. Miller, I should mention that I've noticed you have a guest on the property." He gestured vaguely toward the river. "The loan agreement does specify that commercial use of the property requires notification to the bank." Raymond felt a flash of anger. "She's camping, paying a small fee to use a patch of ground nobody was using anyway." "Technically, that's a commercial arrangement," Wheeler persisted. "I just need to document it for our files. What did you say her name was?" "I didn't." Raymond turned away, heading toward the barn. "Storm's coming, Mr. Wheeler. Road gets slick when it's wet. Best head back to town." As the banker's Mercedes disappeared down the driveway, Raymond leaned against the barn door, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He reached for his pill bottle, remembering too late that it was empty. Taking deep breaths, he waited for the sensation to pass. The phone in his pocket buzzed. "The pharmacy." Raymond answered quickly. "Mr. Miller, this is Greg from Miller's Pharmacy. Dr. Patel approved a 2-week supply of your medication, but—" The pharmacist hesitated. "Your Medicare Part D coverage is in the donut hole phase. The out-of-pocket cost will be $218 or $47. Raymond closed his eyes. The camping fee would cover it, but that would leave nothing for the irrigation pump. "Mr. Miller, are you there?" "Yes, I'll come pick it up tomorrow." "We close at 6, the pharmacist reminded him. "I'll be there." Raymond ended the call, staring at the darkening sky. The first fat raindrops began to fall as he made his way back to the house. By the time he reached the porch, the sky had opened up completely, rain hammering down with surprising force. Raymond watched the downpour from the shelter of the porch, thinking about Catherine Jenkins down by the river and wondering if she'd heeded his warning about the flash flood potential. An hour into the storm, as Raymond was heating a can of soup for dinner, a pounding on his door startled him. He opened it to find Catherine Jenkins on his porch, drenched and exhausted, her arms full of waterproof equipment bags. "The river's rising fast," she said without preamble. "I moved most of my gear to higher ground, but I was hoping to take you up on that offer to use the equipment shed." "Of course," Raymond replied, stepping back to let her in. "You can put that down in the mudroom for now." Catherine gratefully set her equipment on the tiled floor of the small entryway, removing her soaked jacket and boots. "Thank you. The water came up much faster than I expected. Eagle River's been known to do that. Watershed upstream collects from a wide area. Raymond moved back to the kitchen, checking on his soup. After a moment's hesitation, he added another can to the pot. You should get dry. Bathroom's upstairs if you want a hot shower. First door on the right. Catherine looked surprised by the offer, but didn't refuse. That's very kind. I have dry clothes in my pack. While she was upstairs, Raymond set two places at the kitchen table. The domesticity of the task felt strange after so many years of eating alone. The house seemed suddenly smaller with another person in it, more like a home than the empty museum to his past it had become. When Catherine returned, her hair was still damp, but she wore dry clothes and looked considerably more comfortable. She carried a small device in her hand. The radio says the storm's intensifying, she reported. Flash flood warnings for the whole county. Raymond nodded, ladling soup into bowls. Heard the same on my weather alert. You might be stuck here a while. Forecast says it could last through the night. I'll be fine once it passes. I've weathered worse conditions during my filming career. Catherine accepted the offered bowl with thanks. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence, the drumming of rain on the roof filling the space where conversation might have been. Through the window, occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the yard, followed by rumbling thunder. You said you're a documentary filmmaker, Raymond said finally, breaking the silence. That seems like unusual work. Catherine nodded, seeming grateful for the opening. It's been my passion for almost 20 years now. I started as a wildlife photographer, but I found I was more interested in how natural systems and human communities interact. And people watch this? Raymond asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than dismissive. More than you might expect, Catherine replied with a small smile. My series on American watersheds has a dedicated following on public television. People are drawn to stories about places they might never visit themselves, especially when those places are disappearing or changing. River's been running through this property since before my grandfather bought the land, Raymond said. Used to be deeper. Drought's been hard on it, same as everything else around here. The comment opened a door that Catherine hadn't expected so soon. How long has the drought been affecting this area? Raymond took a sip of water before answering. 3 years of below-average rainfall. This year's been the worst. Corn yield will be maybe 40% of normal, and that's with irrigation pulling from the river when I can manage it. That must be incredibly challenging. Farming's always challenging. Nature doesn't owe us good conditions. The stoicism in his voice was undermined slightly by the tightness around his eyes. But this stretch has been harder than most. Lots of farms around here going under. Including yours. The question slipped out before Catherine could consider its bluntness, and she immediately regretted it. I'm sorry. That was too personal. To her surprise, Raymond didn't seem offended. It's a fair question, given the state of things you can see for yourself. He set down his spoon and looked directly at her. Yes, including mine. Most likely. Banks' patience is running out. Can't blame them. Business is business. The frank admission caught Catherine off guard. She'd expected more resistance to discussing financial troubles. I'm sorry to hear that. Has your family been here a long time? 3 generations. My grandfather purchased the first 80 acres in 1938. My father doubled it. I maintained it, and I'll be the one to lose it. The matter-of-fact way he stated this made it all the more poignant. That's not for your documentary. By the way, just answering your question. Of course, Catherine assured him, though her documentarian's mind was already seeing the narrative potential. Everything is off the record unless you explicitly agree otherwise. After dinner, as they sat on the porch watching darkness settle over the farm, a comfortable silence between them, Catherine found herself unexpectedly emotional about the situation. In just one day, she had discovered a story far more compelling than she'd anticipated when she first selected Eagle River as a filming location. I want you to know, she said carefully, that I think what you're dealing with here, the struggles of family farms, the impact of climate change on agriculture, these are important stories that often go untold. If you ever did want to share your perspective, I believe it could help people understand what's happening to rural America. Raymond gazed out at his rain-soaked fields, considering her words. Not sure anyone cares much about old farmers going broke. Been happening for decades. People care more than you might think, Catherine countered gently. There's a growing disconnect between urban consumers and the sources of their food. Your story could bridge that gap, help people understand the human cost of the agricultural changes happening across the country. Raymond didn't respond immediately, and Catherine didn't push. She'd planted a seed, but it would need time to germinate. They continued sitting in companionable silence, watching lightning flash in the distance as the storm began to move eastward. Morning arrived with watery sunlight filtering through dissipating clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the brightening sky and fields glistening with moisture. Raymond was already awake and working when Catherine came downstairs, the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeting her. "Hope you slept okay," Raymond said by way of greeting, sliding eggs from a cast-iron skillet onto 2 plates. "Figured you might want breakfast before heading back to your camp." "I slept very well. Thank you." Catherine accepted the offered plate. "How bad is the flooding?" "River's over its banks but receding. Your camping spot's underwater, though not as bad as I feared. Road to town should be passable by afternoon." He poured coffee for both of them and sat down across from her. "Got some cleaning up to do around the place. Storm blew down some branches, tore loose a section of the equipment shed roof." And Catherine nodded, her mind already calculating how this would affect her filming schedule. "I can help with cleanup if you'd like, before I reset my camp." Raymond looked surprised at the offer. "You don't have to do that. Not part of our arrangement." "Consider it neighborly assistance," Catherine suggested. "Besides, I'm curious to see more of your operation. It would help me understand the context of the river ecosystem better." It was a professional justification, but not entirely honest. The truth was, Catherine found herself genuinely interested in Raymond and his farm, beyond just their potential as documentary subjects. There was something compelling about his quiet resilience, the way he carried his burdens without complaint. After breakfast, they surveyed the damage together. The river had indeed breached its banks, water spreading several yards beyond its normal course. Catherine's campsite was partially submerged, though her decision to move equipment the previous day had prevented any losses. The farm buildings had weathered the storm reasonably well, with the exception of the equipment shed's roof panel that had come loose in the wind. "I can hold the ladder while you work on the roof," Catherine offered, rolling up her sleeves. Raymond looked skeptical. "You sure about that?" "Not exactly what documentary filmmakers usually do." "I'm not filming today anyway, until the water recedes," she pointed out pragmatically. "And I'm stronger than I look." Over the next few hours, they worked together repairing storm damage around the farm. By noon, they'd made significant progress, and Raymond seemed impressed by her willingness to tackle physical labor. "You're not what I expected," he admitted as they paused for water near the barn. "Most city folks I've met would be complaining about broken nails and lack of cell service by now," Catherine laughed. "I spend weeks at a time in remote locations for my work. I've camped in deserts, hiked through swamps, and once spent 3 days on a small fishing boat during a nor'easter to get footage. Farm work is actually quite pleasant by comparison." "Still," Raymond said, wiping sweat from his brow, "you didn't sign up for manual labor when you asked to camp here. I appreciate the help." "Actually," Catherine began, seizing the opening, "this is giving me a much better understanding of how the river integrates with your farming operation. If you're still open to it, I'd love to include some of this context in my documentary." Raymond considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Guess I could answer some questions about the river, how we use it for irrigation. Nothing too personal, though." "Of course," Catherine agreed quickly. "Just factual information about how the waterway supports agriculture." Purnim. By late afternoon, Eagle River had largely returned to its banks, though running higher and faster than before the storm. Catherine's campsite was muddy but usable again. Raymond helped her reset her tent on slightly higher ground and retrieve the rest of her equipment from the house. "You're welcome to keep using the bathroom at the house," he offered as they finished setting up. Probably more comfortable than whatever camping arrangements you have. That's very kind. Thank you, Catherine replied, surprised by the continued hospitality. It seemed the storm had washed away some of Raymond's initial reserve. That evening, as Catherine reviewed her footage and made plans for the next day's filming, she felt a growing sense of purpose about this project. Eagle River wasn't just an ecological feature, it was a thread running through human lives, through economic systems, through the changing relationship between Americans and their food sources. And Raymond Miller, with his quiet dignity and looming loss, personified a pivotal moment in that ongoing story. Her phone rang, displaying her producer's name. Catherine hesitated before answering, moving away from the campsite toward a more private spot. Jenkins, she answered professionally. Catherine, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for days. The agitated voice of Michael Davis, her longtime producer and sometimes friend, came through clearly despite the rural location. I'm on location in Missouri, working on the Eagle River segment. The storm knocked out cell service yesterday. Missouri. That wasn't on the schedule until next month. I rearranged things. The drought conditions made this location more urgent. Catherine kept her tone even, professional. I've got some compelling footage of the river ecosystem during flash flood conditions. Should work well with the drought contrast. That's good, I guess. Michael sounded distracted. Listen, I've got news. PBS is still hesitant about the next series given the situation with the last documentary, but I might have found an alternative. Netstream is looking for environmental content for their new documentary channel. They've expressed interest in our pitch. Catherine felt a surge of both hope and apprehension. Netstream was a major streaming platform, offering far wider distribution than public television, but they were also known for sensationalizing content. What's the catch, Michael? A pause. They want more human drama, environmental stories with clear villains and heroes, stories that get viewers emotionally invested. Catherine's stomach tightened. You know that's not how I work. Real environmental stories are complex, with multiple stakeholders and… I know, Michael interrupted. But we need this. Catherine, after the Riverside controversy, we're running out of options. Just keep an eye out for compelling personal angles. Okay, a farmer losing his land to drought and bank foreclosure while trying to preserve natural resources, that could be exactly the kind of story they're looking for. The call ended with Catherine feeling conflicted. She stared at the darkened farmhouse in the distance, where a single light burned in what she assumed was Raymond's kitchen. She'd begun this project with pure intentions, documenting Eagle River's ecosystem. Now she found herself contemplating a story that would place Raymond's personal struggle at the center. Would that be exploitation, or would it actually help his situation by bringing attention to the plight of family farmers? The ethical line seemed suddenly blurrier than before. The following morning, Raymond met Catherine at the river as agreed, looking somewhat self-conscious but determined. So how do we do this? He asked, eyeing her camera setup with mild apprehension. Should I prepare something to say? Just be yourself, Catherine assured him, adjusting her equipment. I'll ask questions, and you answer naturally. We can always do multiple takes if needed, but authentic responses usually work best. She positioned Raymond near the irrigation pump, with the river flowing behind him, creating a perfect visual context. The morning light cast a golden glow across the scene, highlighting the weathered lines of his face and the practical intelligence in his eyes. Whenever you're ready, Raymond said, squaring his shoulders slightly. Catherine began with simple questions about the river, how long it had been part of the farm's water management, how its flow had changed over his lifetime, what wildlife he remembered seeing along its banks as a child compared to now. Raymond answered thoughtfully, initially stiff but gradually relaxing as the conversation flowed. My earliest memory of this river, he told the camera, is coming down here with my grandfather when I was maybe 5 years old. He taught me to fish with just a piece of string, a bent pin, and some bread for bait. Caught a sunfish right about there. He pointed to a shaded pool beneath an overhanging willow. River was deeper then, ran strong year-round. Now it dries to a trickle in late summer, unless we get lucky with rain. As the interview progressed, Catherine gently steered the conversation toward the challenges facing small farms. Raymond spoke with surprising candor about the economic realities that had pushed family operations like his to the brink. Used to be you could make a decent living on 180 acres, he explained, gazing across his fields. Now the big operations run thousands of acres, have equipment that costs more than my entire farm, contracts with processors that small farmers can't access. Economy of scale, as they call it, and the drought has made things worse. 3 bad years in a row, he continued when Catherine prompted. Each one, I plant with hope. Pray for rain, watch the sky instead of the markets. Could handle economic pressure or climate pressure, but both together? He shook his head, not completing the thought but not needing to. What will happen to the farm? Catherine asked, the camera capturing the momentary flicker of pain that crossed his features before his expression settled back into stoic acceptance. Bank forecloses in 60 days unless I find about $85,000, he said matter-of-factly. Then it goes to auction, probably get bought by one of the corporate operations expanding through the area. They'll tear down the house, the barns, buildings my grandfather raised with his own hands, put up metal structures that can house bigger equipment, more efficient that way. How does that make you feel? It was a standard documentary question, but Catherine found herself genuinely wanting to know the answer. Raymond was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the land that had been his family's for generations. Like I've failed, he finally said, his voice low but steady. Not just my ancestors who worked so hard to build this place, but the future generations who won't ever know what it means to be connected to land this way, my daughter included. He met Catherine's eyes directly. But feeling sorry for myself won't change what's coming. Just have to face it with whatever dignity I can muster. The honesty of his answer caught Catherine off guard, creating one of those rare documentary moments that transcended the typical interview format. She let the camera run silently for several seconds, capturing Raymond's expression as he gazed across his farm, the weight of his impending loss visible in the set of his shoulders. Throughout the day, they continued filming at various locations around the property, the aging barn with its hand-hewn beams, the fields where drought-stressed corn struggled to produce, the family cemetery where Raymond's parents, grandparents, and wife were buried on a quiet hillside overlooking the river. At each location, Raymond shared stories and observations, gradually painting a picture of a way of life that was disappearing not just from his own future, but from the American landscape as a whole. By late afternoon, Catherine had hours of powerful footage. Raymond had proven to be a natural on camera, his authenticity and thoughtfulness coming through clearly. They ended the day's filming back at the river, where Raymond demonstrated how he monitored water quality and flow rate to determine irrigation schedules. The river and I have a deal, he explained, crouching to scoop water in his weathered hands. I only take what I absolutely need, and I try to keep it clean for whoever's downstream. My father taught me that water isn't really owned by anyone. We're just borrowing it for a while. As they walked back toward the house, Raymond suddenly paused, his attention caught by something in the water. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, wading a few steps into the shallows. What is it? Catherine asked, camera still rolling. Raymond reached down and carefully lifted what appeared to be a small fish, cupping it gently in his hands. Haven't seen one of these in years. Missouri spike darter. Used to be common in these parts when I was a boy, then disappeared with all the runoff from the big operations upstream. Catherine zoomed in on the small fish, its distinctive markings clearly visible in Raymond's calloused palm. It's endangered, isn't it? Raymond nodded, gently returning the fish to the water. Thought they were gone from Eagle River completely. This is the first I've seen in at least a decade. A rare smile crossed his face. That's a good sign. Means the water's cleaner than it used to be. Catherine continued filming as the fish darted away into deeper water. That's incredible footage, she said quietly. The return of an endangered species is a powerful indicator of ecosystem health. Raymond's expression turned thoughtful. Wonder if it's just passing through or if there's more of them. He glanced at Catherine. Might be worth looking into for your documentary. I mean, absolutely, she agreed, already envisioning how this discovery could enhance the narrative. This adds a whole new dimension to the story of Eagle River. Over the next 3 days, Catherine and Raymond fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with filming Raymond at his daily chores, feeding animals, checking irrigation, walking fields to assess crop conditions. Afternoons were spent exploring different aspects of the farm's relationship with Eagle River. Raymond proved to be an increasingly engaging subject, his initial reserve giving way to thoughtful reflections on farming, family history, and the changes he'd witnessed over his lifetime. On the fourth day, as they were reviewing some footage together on Catherine's laptop, her phone rang with a call from Michael. She excused herself and walked a short distance away to take it. Jenkins, she answered professionally. Catherine, the sample footage you sent is extraordinary. Her producer's voice carried the unmistakable tone of excitement that came with recognizing exceptional material. Miller is perfect, authentic, articulate, visually compelling, and the story angle is exactly what Netstream is looking for to launch their environmental channel. I'm glad you see the potential, Catherine replied, glancing back toward Raymond, who was still examining her laptop screen with interest. There's a real human story here alongside the environmental narrative. More than that, Michael continued enthusiastically. This could be our breakout piece. I've already shown the demo reel to the Netstream executives, and they're talking about featuring it prominently in their launch. They might even want to spin it off as a special feature. Catherine felt a surge of professional pride mixed with surprise. That's unexpected. I thought this would just be one segment of the series. It started that way, but this is too good to limit. Listen, Netstream wants to move quickly on this. Can you get more in-depth material on the foreclosure angle? The conflict between family farming and corporate agriculture. That's the human drama that will draw viewers. I can, Catherine said slowly, but I want to be careful about how we frame this. Raymond Mr. Miller isn't looking for publicity or to become a symbol. He's just trying to maintain his dignity through a difficult transition. Of course, Michael assured her, though Catherine detected the slight impatience that suggested personal concerns were secondary to the story potential. Just keep getting the material. We'll handle it respectfully in editing. After ending the call, Catherine returned to Raymond, her mind racing with the implications of Netstream's interest. What had begun as one segment in a documentary series about waterways was evolving into something much larger. Everything okay? Raymond asked, noting her pensive expression. Yes, Catherine replied, deciding not to share the full scope of the network's interest yet. My producer was just giving me some feedback on the footage. He thinks it's coming together well. That evening, as they ate dinner on the farmhouse porch, Catherine found herself contemplating the ethical dimensions of documentary filmmaking more deeply than usual. The line between documenting reality and influencing it had always been blurry in her profession, but never had it felt quite so personal. You've been quiet tonight, Raymond observed as they finished their meal, having second thoughts about spending so much time on a failing farm. The question was asked lightly, but Catherine sensed the genuine uncertainty beneath it. Not at all. Actually, I'm thinking this material might be more significant than I initially planned. My producers are very impressed with what they've seen. Raymond raised an eyebrow. Not sure what's impressive about watching a man lose his livelihood, but I suppose that's why you're the filmmaker and I'm just the subject. It's not about showcasing failure, Catherine clarified quickly. It's about telling an important story about American agriculture, rural communities, and our relationship with the land. Your perspective matters, especially because it's becoming increasingly rare. Raymond considered this, then nodded slowly. Well, if it helps someone understand what's being lost when places like this disappear, I suppose that's something worthwhile coming from this mess. The next morning, as Catherine was setting up for another interview, Raymond approached her with an unexpected proposal. "There's something I want to show you," he said, his manner suggesting this was significant. "Something I haven't talked about yet that might add another dimension to your story." Intrigued, Catherine readily agreed. Soon they were following a narrow trail along the riverbank on Raymond's ATV, heading upstream from her camping spot. After about 15 minutes, the trail widened into a small clearing beside the river. "This is the oldest part of the property," Raymond explained as they walked toward the water. "Land my grandfather purchased first, before expanding the farm. Family lore says he chose this spot because of that." He pointed across the river to where a remarkable formation rose from the opposite bank, a natural spring bubbling up from limestone rocks, creating a small waterfall that cascaded into the river. The morning sunlight caught the falling water, transforming it into a glittering curtain against the dark stone. "It's beautiful," Catherine said sincerely, already framing shots in her mind. The visual appeal was undeniable, but she wasn't sure how this connected to the documentary's themes. "It's more than just pretty," Raymond continued, leading her closer. "This spring has never run dry, not even during the worst droughts on record. My grandfather called it the heart spring because as long as it was beating, the land would survive." He crouched beside the river, dipping his hand into the clear water. "The water from this spring keeps this section of the river flowing even when other parts slow to a trickle. It's why Eagle River has always been more reliable than other waterways in the region." Catherine knelt beside him, camera forgotten for the moment as she absorbed the significance. "So this spring is essentially drought-proof. That seems incredibly valuable in today's climate conditions." Raymond nodded. "That's what I've been thinking these past few years. Most farmers around here are drilling deeper wells or watching their irrigation ponds dry up. Meanwhile, this spring keeps flowing at a constant rate, year-round." He stood, gesturing to the surrounding area. "I've been experimenting up here, out of sight of the main farm. Started 5 years ago when I first noticed the drought patterns changing." For the first time, Catherine noticed what appeared to be an experimental garden area set back from the river-raised beds with various plants growing in controlled conditions. A small greenhouse-like structure made from salvaged windows, and what looked like a homemade irrigation system that channeled water from the spring. "What exactly are you growing here?" she asked, following as Raymond led her toward the plots. "Drought-resistant heritage crops," he explained, pride evident in his voice. "Seeds passed down through my family, plus varieties I've sourced from other farmers facing similar conditions, plants that can produce with minimal water, resist pests naturally, and still provide good nutrition." Inside the makeshift greenhouse, Raymond showed Catherine trays of seedlings and carefully labeled seed storage. "I've been selectively breeding for drought tolerance, trying to develop strains specifically adapted to our changing conditions. It's small scale, just a hobby really, but it could be significant," Catherine finished, her mind racing with the implications. "You're essentially creating a genetic bank of drought-resistant crops, developed through traditional farming knowledge rather than corporate bioengineering." Raymond nodded, seeming pleased that she understood. "Corporate agriculture develops seeds for maximum yield under ideal conditions, with heavy chemical inputs. I'm looking for plants that can survive when conditions aren't ideal, using methods any farmer could replicate without expensive technology." Catherine began filming, capturing the experimental plots, the spring that made them possible, and Raymond explaining his methodology. This was exactly the narrative element she'd been missing. Not a magical solution to his financial problems, but a demonstration that traditional farming wisdom might hold answers to modern agricultural challenges that corporate approaches overlooked. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked as she filmed him harvesting seeds from a particularly robust tomato plant. "Started small after Eleanor passed," Raymond replied. "She always kept a garden, and I found it therapeutic, I guess, to continue that work. When the drought hit, it became more purposeful." Now I correspond with a network of other farmers doing similar experiments. We exchange seeds, share results. And does the bank know about this work? Catherine asked carefully. Raymond shook his head. It's not the kind of thing that changes a balance sheet. Can't put a dollar value on seeds that might produce better crops years from now. Banks deal in this quarter's numbers, not long-term resilience. Back at the farmhouse that evening, Catherine called Michael to share the exciting development. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. "This is gold! Catherine!" the producer exclaimed. The seed-saving angle ties perfectly into current conversations about agricultural resilience and corporate control of food systems. We need to highlight this prominently, maybe even adjust the title to reflect this new dimension. The remainder of the day was spent filming additional material about Raymond's seed-saving work, including close-ups of his meticulous records and the various heritage varieties he was preserving. By evening, Catherine had a wealth of new footage that significantly expanded the documentary's scope and added a crucial element of forward-looking hope to what had previously been primarily a story of loss. That night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk, Raymond made an announcement that took Catherine by surprise. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "if your network is serious about this documentary, I'd like to reach out to my daughter. She should see this not just what's being lost, but what might still be saved." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Catherine replied warmly. "Family connections are precious, especially during difficult transitions." Raymond nodded, his expression a complex mixture of hope and apprehension. "Haven't told her about the foreclosure yet. Kept thinking I'd find a solution first. Wouldn't have to admit defeat. But your film might be a better way for her to understand what's happening here than any explanation I could give." Catherine hesitated, then asked the question she'd been curious about since their first substantive conversation. "If you don't mind me asking, what happened between you and your daughter? You mentioned she left." Raymond was silent for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard before. "Sarah was always bright, too bright for farm life. Probably got a full scholarship to Boston University. I was proud of her, even though it meant she'd be leaving. But then her mother got sick cancer during Sarah's sophomore year." He paused, looking out across the darkened fields. "Eleanor insisted she stay in school, finish her degree. I agreed, but Sarah came home anyway. Took a semester off to help care for her mother. After Eleanor died, things changed between us. Sarah found some financial papers, realized we'd sold 50 acres to pay for her mother's treatments. Insurance wouldn't cover the experimental protocol. You see, she was angry that we hadn't told her, that we'd sacrificed part of the farm. Said I was too proud, too stubborn to ask for help. We had a terrible argument the night before she went back to school. Said things we both regretted. After that, our relationship was never the same. She finished her law degree, got a job in Boston, married a professor. Visits at Christmas became phone calls, then just cards. Now it's mostly texts on birthdays." Catherine absorbed this information, understanding now the deeper currents beneath Raymond's stoic exterior. "And you've never told her about your seed project. Mentioned it once or twice. She seemed to think it was just an old man's hobby, not worth discussing." Raymond's smile held a touch of sadness. "Maybe seeing it through your eyes will help her understand." The next week passed in a blur of intensive filming, with the new focus on Raymond's seed-saving work in addition to the conventional farming and river ecology. Catherine had more material to capture than originally planned, and Raymond seemed energized by sharing this aspect of his work, speaking with genuine passion about the heritage varieties he was preserving and the potential they held for farming in increasingly unpredictable climate conditions. On her final scheduled day at the farm, Catherine arranged for drone footage to capture aerial views of the entire property. As the drone operator packed up his equipment, Raymond and Catherine stood at the edge of a cornfield, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. "So that's it?" Raymond asked, squinting against the sunlight. "You have what you need now." Catherine nodded, feeling strangely reluctant to confirm that her work here was done. I think so. The footage is extraordinary. Raymond, your story, this place, it's all come together in a way that exceeds anything I could have hoped for. When do you leave? His question was practical, devoid of sentiment, but Catherine sensed the unspoken weight behind it. Tomorrow morning, I need to get back to begin the editing process. My producer wants to fast-track this for a special screening. In St. Louis, actually, where your daughter lives. Environmental groups, agricultural policy experts, media, they'll all be there. You'd be welcome to attend, of course. It might be a good opportunity to reconnect with Sarah in person. Raymond considered this, then nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Still need to call her. Let her know what's happening with the farm. That evening, they shared a final dinner at the farmhouse. Catherine had purchased ingredients in town and prepared a meal more elaborate than their usual fare. A gesture of gratitude for Raymond's hospitality and openness. Over roasted chicken and vegetables from his garden, they discussed practical matters related to the documentary's completion. The next morning, Catherine packed her equipment in camp with Raymond's help. As she loaded the last of her gear into her SUV, she turned to Raymond, suddenly awkward in the moment of departure. Thank you, she said simply, for your trust, your openness, everything you've shared. Raymond extended his hand formally, and Catherine took it, feeling the calluses and strength built over decades of physical labor. Thank you for listening, he replied. Not many do these days. The drive away from the Miller farm was more emotional than Catherine had anticipated. Through her rear-view mirror, she watched Raymond's figure growing smaller, standing straight backed at the end of his driveway, hand raised in farewell. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd be the last person to document this place as the Miller farm. If her filming had captured the final chapter of a multi-generational story. But as she reached the main road and turned toward the interstate that would take her back to her urban life, Catherine felt a renewed sense of purpose about the project ahead. Raymond's story deserved to be told with all the complexity and nuance she could bring to it. And perhaps, just perhaps, telling it might lead to outcomes neither of them could yet imagine. Sir. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of intensive editing sessions, supplemental interviews, and constant communication with Netstream. Catherine worked longer hours than she ever had before, driven by both the tight deadline and her personal commitment to doing Raymond's story justice. 10 days into the editing process, Catherine reached out to Sarah Miller in Boston, sending a professional email explaining the documentary project and extending an invitation to the upcoming screening. Her response surprised Catherine with its immediacy and concern. Ms. Jenkins, it began formally, thank you for your message regarding the documentary about my father's farm. I must admit I was surprised to learn about this project, as my father hadn't mentioned it in our limited recent communications. While I appreciate the invitation to the screening, I'm curious about the nature of the documentary and concerned about how my father is being portrayed. The protective tone suggested a more complicated relationship between father and daughter than Raymond had indicated. Catherine arranged a phone call to address Sarah's concerns directly. I want to be clear, Sarah said after Catherine had explained the project in more detail. My father and I may have our differences, but I don't want to see him turned into some kind of rural poverty stereotype for urban audiences to feel sorry for. That's absolutely not the approach we're taking, Catherine assured her. Your father is presented as knowledgeable, innovative, and resilient. The documentary examines systemic issues in agriculture that have made it difficult for family farms to survive regardless of how well they're managed, and it highlights your father's experimental work with heritage seeds, which has significant potential value for sustainable agriculture. There was a pause on the line. Heritage seeds, Dad's actually talking about that, surprise-colored Sarah's voice. He's been sending me emails about those experiments for years, but whenever I try to discuss it during our calls, he changes the subject, says it's just a hobby, nothing worth mentioning. It's a central focus of the documentary, Catherine explained, intrigued by this glimpse into their relationship. Your father's knowledge of selective breeding for drought resistance, combined with traditional farming techniques, offers a powerful alternative to corporate agricultural approaches. He showed you the spring site. Sarah sounded genuinely shocked now. He never takes anyone there. That was my mother's favorite spot on the farm. After she died, it became like a private memorial for him. Catherine absorbed this information, understanding now why that location had seemed so personal to Raymond. I didn't realize, she said quietly. He presented it primarily in terms of its agricultural significance. That's Dad, Sarah said with what sounded like a mix of exasperation and fondness. Everything filtered through the farm perspective. She sighed audibly. So the bank is really foreclosing. He hasn't told me directly. Yes, Catherine confirmed gently. 60 days from when I started filming, which is now down to about 30 days. Unless something changes dramatically. Another long pause followed. I'll come to the screening, Sarah finally said. And I'd like to see a rough cut beforehand, if that's possible. Catherine immediately emailed Raymond to update him about the conversation. Raymond's reply was brief but revealed his emotion in its uncharacteristic exclamation. She's coming to the screening. Thank you, Catherine. This means more than I can say. 2 days before the St. Louis screening, Catherine sent the completed documentary to Netstream executives for final approval. Their response was everything she had hoped for: enthusiastic praise for the film's emotional impact, visual beauty, and social relevance. On the evening before flying to St. Louis for the screening, Catherine received an unexpected call from Raymond. Just wanted to check in before tomorrow, he said, his voice carrying the slight awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to making personal calls. I spoke with Sarah yesterday. First real conversation we've had in years. She said some things about the farm, about what she saw in the documentary. Made me think maybe I've been wrong about what she wants. In what way? Catherine asked gently. Always assumed she wanted nothing to do with farming, with the family legacy. But the way she talked about seeing the place on screen, there was something there I hadn't heard before. Raymond's voice held a note of cautious hope. Anyway, just wanted you to know that something's already changed. Even before this film reaches a wider audience, the Logan Theater in downtown St. Louis gleamed with sleek modernity, its glass facade reflecting the city lights as evening fell. Inside, the venue buzzed with activity as staff prepared for the screening of Seeds of Resilience. Promotional posters featuring a striking image of Raymond standing beside Eagle River, the farmhouse visible in the background, lined the entrance hall. Catherine arrived early, elegant in a simple black dress that contrasted with her usual field attire. She oversaw the technical checks, ensuring the documentary would be presented with optimal sound and visual quality. While Michael and Netstream executives circulated among early arrivals, agricultural experts and media representatives who had been invited to the event, Raymond arrived an hour before the screening, looking different in his suit, a garment that had likely hung unworn in his closet for years, but carrying himself with the same quiet dignity Catherine had observed on the farm. Raymond, Catherine called, making her way through the crowd to greet him. You made it. Wouldn't have missed it, he replied with a small smile, visibly relieved to see a familiar face. Quite a production you've put together here. The network has been incredibly supportive, Catherine explained, guiding him toward a quieter area away from the growing crowd. There's significant interest in your story from environmental groups, agricultural policy experts, even some potential funders for sustainable farming initiatives. Raymond nodded, appearing somewhat overwhelmed by the implications. And Sarah, has she arrived? Not yet, but she confirmed she's coming. The screening starts in 45 minutes. 20 minutes before the screening was scheduled to begin, Catherine noticed a shift in Raymond's attention, his gaze fixed on the theater doors. Following his line of sight, she saw a woman who could only be Sarah Miller, the same direct gaze as her father, though softened by stylish glasses and framed by a more contemporary haircut. She was accompanied by a teenage boy, presumably her son Jason. She's here, Catherine said softly to Raymond, whose expression had transformed into a complex mixture of pride, nervousness, and hope. Yes, Raymond replied, straightening his shoulders slightly. Guess I should go. Go, Catherine encouraged. I'll handle things here. She watched as Raymond made his way across the room toward his daughter and grandson. Their meeting was understated, no dramatic embraces or visible emotion, just a handshake that turned into a brief, awkward hug, followed by conversation too distant to overhear. But even from across the room, Catherine could see the tension gradually easing from Raymond's posture as they talked. The theater filled quickly, an energetic buzz of anticipation rising from the audience. Catherine took her place between Michael and a NetStream executive, with Raymond, Sarah, and Jason seated a few rows ahead. As the lights dimmed and the network introduction began to play, Catherine found herself unexpectedly nervous about how Raymond would feel, seeing his life and impending loss projected on a massive screen before strangers. The documentary opened with the aerial footage of the Miller farm, Eagle River winding like a silver ribbon through the drought-stressed landscape. Raymond's voice, steady and unadorned, provided the narration. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather broke the soil, my father expanded it, and I'll be the one to lose it. From that powerful opening, the film unfurled Raymond's story with intimate detail and broader context, the personal struggles of maintaining a family farm in changing economic and environmental conditions, interwoven with expert commentary on agricultural policy, climate challenges, and the disappearance of traditional farming knowledge. The audience was visibly moved by footage of Raymond explaining his connection to the land and fell into reverent silence during the scenes at the spring site, where his passion for heritage seed preservation shone through. The discovery of the endangered Missouri spike darter in Eagle River added an unexpected environmental twist that connected Raymond's personal story to larger ecological themes. As the credits rolled over a stunning time-lapse sequence of the river flowing through seasonal changes, spontaneous applause broke out in the theater, quickly swelling to a standing ovation. Raymond remained seated, appearing somewhat overwhelmed by the response. Sarah placed a hand briefly on her father's shoulder, a small gesture but significant in its support. The post-screening discussion began with the NetStream executive introducing Catherine, who spoke briefly about the documentary's evolution before inviting Raymond to join her on stage. When the discussion opened to audience questions, the first came from a representative of a Sustainable Agriculture Foundation. Mr. Miller, your work with heritage seeds is extraordinarily valuable, especially your focus on drought resistance. Has anyone approached you about continuing this work in a more formal capacity? Raymond seemed surprised by the question. No, nothing formal. I correspond with other farmers doing similar experiments, but it's all very grassroots. To be honest, I've been more focused on trying to save the farm than thinking about what comes after. Another question followed from an environmental policy expert. Given the clear value of your approach to agricultural resilience, have you considered seeking grant funding or institutional support to continue your research, even if the farm itself changes hands? I haven't, Raymond admitted. Wouldn't know where to begin with something like that. Near the end of the session, a voice from the audience asked, what would it take to save the Miller farm as a working demonstration site for these agricultural techniques? Is there a specific financial threshold that would prevent the foreclosure? Raymond looked momentarily uncomfortable discussing such personal details, but then answered with his typical candor. Bank says I need about $85,000 to bring the mortgage current and get a 2-year extension. That would buy time to implement some of these methods on a larger scale. Maybe achieve profitability again if rainfall patterns improve. The moderator, sensing the shift toward fundraising, prepared to move on, but Sarah Miller suddenly stood up in the front row. With the moderator's permission, she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion, I'd like to address that question as well. Surprised, the moderator nodded, and Sarah made her way to the stage. Standing beside her father, the family resemblance was striking despite their different attire and life paths. I'm Sarah Miller, she began, Raymond's daughter. Until watching this documentary, I didn't fully understand what my father has been developing at the spring site. Like many children who leave family farms, I focused on what I was escaping: the financial stress, the physical toll, the uncertainty. What I failed to appreciate was the knowledge being preserved, the connection to the land that goes beyond mere ownership. She turned slightly toward Raymond. My law firm in Boston recently completed a major environmental case with a substantial settlement. I'm in a position to help prevent the foreclosure, not just as a daughter helping her father, but as an investment in work that has demonstrable value for our agricultural future. The audience erupted in applause, with several people immediately rising to express interest in contributing. Raymond stood motionless, visibly stunned by his daughter's announcement. When the moderator returned to the microphone, Raymond finally spoke. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. "Never expected anything like this." Later that evening, as audience members crowded forward to speak with Raymond and Sarah, Catherine stood slightly apart, observing the scene with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal joy. Michael appeared at her side, beaming with excitement. "This is unprecedented," the producer gushed. "Netstream is already talking about a follow-up documentary on the farm's transformation, and the social media response is exploding. We're trending nationally." Catherine nodded, acknowledging the professional triumph, but more focused on Raymond and Sarah, who stood together amidst a crowd of interested supporters, their body language suggesting a bridge being rebuilt between them. Jason, Sarah's teenage son, was examining one of Raymond's seed notebooks with evident fascination. 2 months later, Catherine stood once again beside Eagle River, camera in hand, documenting a very different scene than her first visit. The foreclosure notice had been canceled, replaced by a flurry of activity as the Miller farm began its transformation into the Miller Agricultural Resilience Center. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her law firm to help with the transition, living in the farmhouse with her father and son as they developed plans for expanding the Heritage Seed program. The documentary Seeds of Resilience had surpassed all expectations, gathering millions of views online and sparking nationwide conversations about sustainable agriculture, family farming, and climate adaptation. Universities had expressed interest in research partnerships, and agricultural students now visited regularly to learn traditional farming techniques being adapted for changing climate conditions. As Catherine filmed Raymond and Sarah walking the fields together, discussing irrigation improvements that would maximize the spring's output, she reflected on how a simple request to camp by a river had led to such a remarkable transformation. The Miller farm had been saved not by charity, but by recognition of the value inherent in Raymond's knowledge and approach, value that might have been lost without documentation. Eagle River still flowed as it always had, indifferent to human concern, yet central to human flourishing. The water that had sustained generations of Miller farmers would now nourish new growth, not just of crops, but of ideas, connections, and possibilities that bridge past wisdom and future needs. And Raymond Miller, no longer the last of his line to work this land, walked alongside his daughter and grandson with the quiet pride of a man who had not failed his ancestors, after all, but instead had found an unexpected way to carry their legacy forward into a changing world. Eagle River still flows as it has for centuries, indifferent to the human dramas played out along its banks. The water that once threatened to wash away a stranger's tent now nourishes new life on land that was nearly lost. Some would call it luck of filmmaker happening upon a failing farm, a story worth telling found in the most ordinary of struggles. Others might see the hand of providence in how a family fractured by grief found healing through the very crisis meant to destroy them. Raymond Miller no longer stands alone at the edge of his fields watching the sunset. The porch that once echoed with solitude now rings with his grandson's questions about seeds that might feed a changing world. And Sarah, who fled this place believing there was nothing here worth saving, now walks these acres with new eyes, seeing not just soil and crops, but a living testament to resilience. What remains when everything seems lost? What stories lie dormant in the places we think we know, waiting for someone to listen? Sometimes it takes a stranger to help us see what we've always had, and sometimes, in saving something precious, we discover we've saved ourselves. The Miller farm continues, not as it was, but as something both ancient and new. In the end, isn't that the story of all things that truly endure?